Okay, hello everybody. My name's Andy Broadey, and welcome to our exhibition, Cosmotechnics. Today we're going to have a discussion accompanying the online exhibition via our website, cosmotechnics.net, which you can visit directly via the internet, or you can visit via the website Hanover Project, linked to Fine Art in Euclid. So I'm just going to really briefly introduce the project, to give you a bit of background on what we've been doing and what you can engage with on the website. So Cosmotechnics is an open-ended research project based in artistic collaboration and sharing practice. And we've all been working together. I'm going to introduce everybody in a second, examining Yuk Hui's term Cosmotechnics. And it's kind of important, we feel, to art making in the 21st century. We're all artists and we're all engaged with cosmotechnics from the viewpoint of making artworks. So I'm going to briefly introduce everybody who we've got on the call today. First person is Simon Blackmore, and Simon makes sound and technology-based works that explore the dynamic between people and machines, and is also a founding member of AL Project. And I'm Andy Broadey. I'm lecturing contemporary art history and theory at University of Central Lancashire, and I'm also involved in running the art gallery Hanover Project. And I'll be talking about my work later in the discussion. Helen Knowles is an artist and curator of the Birthrights collection, and her recent works have critiqued new technologies such as blockchain and artificial technology in elaborate and playful ways, including putting an algorithm on trial for manslaughter. And Paul Dolan makes moving image works that use computer-generated imagery and programming to explore themes of nature, media, materiality, and time. And last but not least, Putnam is an artist philosopher working in performance art, video, sound, and digital media. Her practice focuses on borders and entanglements, particularly of the corporeal and the machinic. So that's everybody in the call. We're all going to discuss the project shortly, but I'm going to give a very, very brief kind of setup of how we got to this place. So the project started in, I've forgotten when it was it 2018 or 2017, Simon, for Radical Reading Assembly?
I'm going to say 18 because...
Let's say 18. In 2018, we several artists in Manchester, including Helen, Simon and myself, got together and worked through Yuk Hui's text, Recursion and Contingency, which had just been published at that point in time. And felt it was a very important contribution to many of the thoughts and ways of working that we were developing as artists. The two key concepts in that book are kind of things that are going to come up later and are going to be important to the discussion as we move forward. But just briefly, the idea of recursion is the key point that activity, really any kind of activity, is bound up or systemic in some way and generates a kind of feedback mechanism. So processes generate a kind of looping structure where systems return to themselves in order to know themselves through operation. That could be something as dynamic as a computer network or a human consciousness. And then contingency is really the kind of developmental or learning aspect of this, whereby systems enfold environmental variation into their functioning and are so always engaged in a process of negotiation and becoming, always changing, always developing. And these were two kind of really big insights that we took from Yuk Hui that we decided we really, really wanted to work through and explore in more detail. And we had the opportunity to do that because we had some funding for exhibitions through Hanover Project via University of Central Lancashire. And so we initiated this exhibition that you're engaging with now. And we assembled this kind of star cast of artists and thinkers to work through some of Yuk Hui's ideas and generate artistic responses to Yuk Hui's work. So initially, we read Yuk Hui's 2015 book, The Question Concerning Technology in China, and we posted copies of this to everybody, and we read through it and kind of discussed it over a series of meetings on Zoom. And in a way, Zoom and the pandemic have become sort of conditioning factors within this exhibition. So it's both a virtual exhibition, so you visit it on a website. We don't have a physical existence. But it's also been a project that's been facilitated through exchange and networking and conversation over video conferencing and WhatsApp and all of these network technologies that we have available to us. And that's felt new and really exciting as part of the project, that we have this opportunity for artists nationally and internationally to collaborate in this way. One thing that so the book draws heavily upon philosophies of technology through thinkers such as Heidegger, Simondon, Bernard Stiegler, and Leroy Juron. Largely a male cast of thinkers went into the development of the book, and that's something we've picked up on and been thoughtful about in this project. So I just want to highlight in the kind of wider literature around Hui's work and around Gilbert Simondon's writing, kind of key thinkers that we've sort of engaged with and thought about, Elizabeth Gros and Sauvignier as well. So one thing that was really important, taking forward this idea of recursion and contingency within this book, was to reframe a relationship between being and technology, and the ways in which things like language, technology, algorithm, etc., define conditions of being. And I guess the big concept that comes up in this book that we've been really thinking about is the ways in which we reintroduces the local or locality or sort of location-specific processes as a condition of the technological construction of being. So we worked through all of that material, and it kind of took us about 6 months to read that book. And then we've opened it out into a process of making and artistic exchange and discussion. And we've started to focus on a special issue in the journal Anglosaxon, and on a particular essay by Yuk Hui called Machine and Ecology, which was written last year. And that's going to be really the area that we focus on in the discussion today. So I'm going to kind of bring in some other voices now to the discussion, and we're going to start to unpack some of the ideas, building on recursion and contingency, and this idea of relations between technology and being and locality as they come up within machine and ecology. So I'm going to pass over to Paul, and Paul's going to give us a little kind of setup of the concept of cosmotechnics.
That sounds like not a very straightforward thing to do. I think the first thing that happened upon reading the question concerning technology in China was that you kind of come to realize that it's very interconnected with quite a wide array of different philosophies, different existing concepts. And there's a lot of back reading and a lot of trying to fill in concepts to make sense of what Yuk Hui is trying to say. One of those journal articles that really helped was the Machine and Ecology paper. So I think just to start us off, one of the things that comes out of thinking about cosmotechnics is that it is a way of thinking or reapproaching, reframing the ways that we kind of work with technology, the way that we conceive of technologies and the way that they're used. And from a non-Western viewpoint, so Hui's trying to create this sense that there is a technological consciousness, this sense that we have this unthinking use of technology, the way that technologies are conceived of, produced and used, and that they have really come from this aggressive kind of ubiquitous Western capitalist standpoint. And there's this sense with Cosmotechnics that Hui really wants to point back towards this term techno-diversity, a way of conceiving of technologies from a stance other than that, really, the kind of Western capitalist sensibilities. So to talk about techno-diversity, how it kind of describes it as being able to think about technics as in a multiplicity, which is a term from if you're familiar with Deleuze and kind of theories like actor network theory and systems theory, then multiplicity is a term that comes up quite often. It's this idea that things are connected into systems and structures that they're not necessarily able to be conceived of on their own as a single object, but they are kind of constantly interconnected and involved in systems that are always changing. So this idea of techno-diversity here is, as I said, just trying to kind of think of new ways of producing technology that don't come from a particular Western standpoint. One of the things which is, I suppose, quite difficult to get into, but is the kind of ontological basis of this, and how it kind of bases these ideas upon theories of becoming, and yeah, and how technology, the factors that might be involved in the production or conception of a technology. One of those things is geography. And if we're thinking about non-Western ways of producing technology, then the kind of concept of geography and locality become really important, because we're looking at ways that aren't necessarily attached directly to the West. And how it kind of builds upon some existing theories of how geography, how environment might play a part in the production of technologies, and our kind of ideas and conceptions about them. So he brings in Leroy Gohan and also Simondon, who've got these ideas about the milieu, and how a geographical milieu, this idea that the kind of geographical or environmental conditions of where people live, what resources they have around them, and what the climate is like, things like that might play a part in how technology is produced and conceived of. So I think we talk about this a little bit later on, but some of those examples are a little bit problematic in terms of how they are expressed in some of the literature, but we can talk about that later on. But yeah, just to start us off, we have these ideas about kind of ontology, about technology being engaged in these complex processes of becoming within specific environments. The last thing that I was going to say about that was just in terms of ethics, and how one of the things that I think comes out of Cosmotechnics is this reframing of ethics, and the ethics of technology as being a kind of important thing to focus on. And how it kind of brings in Simondon's ideas quite heavily actually within his book. And Simondon in the past had described his theory of individuation, which is kind of like an ontological sequence theory, where he's describing the kind of, within a metaphysical kind of context, he's describing the things that are necessary to occur for a thing to become itself, for an object to become. And so that's kind of one way of looking at the ontological basis for it. But interestingly, Simondon was talking about this as kind of, I think he calls it an axiomatic instead of an ontological process. So there's this kind of, it's quite a cool concept really for Simondon to say this, because he's trying, it sounds like he's trying to pull away from like the cold philosophical ontological basis of doing this, which some philosophers do, and really think about kind of the use of it and how these ideas might actually be practical in real life as a way of thinking about how we could produce technologies that had some kind of ethical basis to them. And I think that definitely comes across in Hui as well with the kind of Cosmotechnics project. Ultimately, it's this sense, even though it's based upon these kind of abstract ontological kind of ideas, there's still this very practical ambition to make Cosmotechnics a useful kind of theory, not just for art making, I think, but for ways that we can think about producing technologies that kind of help the world or move against and challenge the dominant capitalist conception of techniques.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. That's such a rich kind of explanation of the concept. That's wonderful. So I'm going to kind of ask you to respond to that in a sense, to sort of give a little bit of background from where Hui's coming from in his development of technodiversity and cosmotechnics. Because in machine and ecology, there's a kind of, well, it's a pretty explicit critique of cybernetics, and in a sense, there's a kind of linkage. I noticed, maybe respond to this, I noticed a kind of linkage of a kind of growth of cybernetics in relation to the kind of growth of modernity as this kind of sort of one size fits all kind of view of kind of global existence. Would you like to kind of respond to maybe some of the things that Paul said and sort of frame them around some of those ideas?
Sure. I think one of the important things that Paul brings up that we can see in Hui's work, not just the machine and ecology essay, but also in the question concerning technology in China, which is the influence of Gilbert Simondon. And it's not just in his explicit references to Simondon, which he does throughout his work, but his actual method is quite Simondonian, if I was to use the term, which is, Simondon himself writing his work on technology in the 1950s, when a lot of, the theorizations of cybernetics, as we understand from that time, so the work especially of Norbert Wiener and the Macy conferences that have come to kind of dominate the field. But in contrast, Simondon, instead of trying to take this kind of universal approach to technology, his approach is what Donna Haraway would later describe as a kind of situated understanding or knowledge of technology, where it's not just considering technology in abstract terms, but really thinking about how it is used in our milieu of existence. And milieu is the French term he uses, and we generally don't see this term defined into English. It's usually kept in French, and it's to describe that kind of middle space, that environment, or the ecology, as Hui refers to, that we see between technology, how we engage it, how we relate to each other. And so with Simondon, there's a strong emphasis on relation throughout his work. So there is that process of becoming that we see in individuation that Paul brings up, but we're talking about relation not just between humans, but humans with technology and technology as beings. Also, other, organic and, non-technological beings and non-human animals. And these are all working together within these interactions. And that connects to the geographic context. And that's something we can see in Simondon's work. So thinking about the influence of technology on a place, how, for instance, when a train is set up, a train line is set up and influences the environment around it and how we engage with the landscape. And so we can see these qualities, these kinds of interactions throughout Simondon's work that I also see in Hui's work. And so his emphasis in Cosmotechnics about it, not having this kind of universal approach to technology is significant, because when he's talking about, going back to cosmology, and, it's thinking about how different societies and cultures understand how the world works. and taking that into account in how we understand technology.
Brilliant. Wow, fantastic. So that's a lot of kind of theoretical ground that we've just covered there, which is super. I'm interested in now linking that back to the kind of some examples of kind of how we've conceived of developing art projects in relation to this material. So Simon, I'm kind of definitely in terms of this idea of the kind of what's necessary, the idea of what's necessary for development, and the ideas of situated knowledge that Elle was talking about. Maybe you could start to unpack some of the ideas that went into your project, which is kind of enfolding kind of high technology with sort of much more traditional forms of music making.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that really struck me about reading Cosmotechnics, the question concerning technology, that particular book, was his kind of investigation, Hui's investigation of sort of energy, and kind of looking at things like chi energy, and discussing that. And there's another kind of, he did a discussion on an efflux, I think it was an efflux podcast, and another piece of writing where he's talking about the kind of way a butcher in Japan knows how to cut, in China, sorry, knows how to cut a particular piece of meat through this sort of kind of energetic way, an effortless way. And yeah, he spends quite a lot of time talking about that. And I think that's that kind of idea of energy in working with technology is really interesting, because I think a lot of the time energy gets lost. You know, it's kind of about the computer energy, and one of the things I'm interested in is sort of human energies, and I might talk about the kind of well, I'll talk about the project that I've developed is sort of kind of bringing together flamenco with synthesizers, and they're two very distinct forms of working with energy in a way. I guess one is about synthesizers are working with electronic micro, you know, the energy of atoms and electricity, and flamenco is very much about, you know, the touch and the earth and the human energy. So I was kind of thinking about how those two kind of worlds could be linked together, and yeah, that's the kind of basis of the project, and yeah, I found the kind of deep investigation of energy really fascinating, actually.
Brilliant. Yeah, so that's a really kind of interesting example of how that kind of idea of milieu, I guess, the kind of the commingling of completely different levels of technology within a kind of contemporary sort of I guess kind of musical culture. I'm just going to very briefly talk about the kind of the focal point of and we'll talk more in detail about practice in a minute, but I'm going to very briefly just unpack the kind of focal point of my project, which is really the idea of Englishness, and being a kind of white Englishman, trying to think about what that kind of all means in the 21st century to a certain extent, and being very interested in sort of trying to trace back kind of ideas of where Englishness comes from, and, you know, unpacking a research around the first millennium AD, and looking at kind of the diverse sort of places that, you know, sort of the idea of the indigenous within the English is actually a very kind of hard concept to sustain, because senses of kind of cultural hybridity really define the kind of generation of England as a country. And I guess I've been very motivated by what that means in the context of a kind of deglobalizing international scene, and within the context of kind of resurgent nationalisms as well. I think that's probably a background motivation within the project. And I've been very sort of interested in how those nationalisms kind of reprocess symbolism and ideas through kind of highly kind of technologized, networked, machinic structures in order to reestablish, you know, and sometimes in very kind of crude ways, senses of what it means to be a kind of person from England. And so I've started to try and think about a kind of, I guess, almost like a deep time of Englishness, going as far back as I can, as far back as is sensible for the generation of that concept, in order to start unpicking and dismantling some of those assumptions as well. So I guess again, coming back to that idea of the generation of identity within a particular milieu. I'm wondering where we move next. So, Paul, do you want to say anything else about the local, or should we move straight on to talking about kind of cosmotechnics in relation to capitalism, which Helen's going to comment on? Do you have anything else you want to add on the local, Paul?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, in cosmotechnics and question concerning technology in China, this idea of the locals still kind of unresolved, I would say. I think that from my perspective and thinking about some of the ideas in my work, and also with what you were saying there as well, Andy, about kind of identity and national identity, I think that the way that the world feels these days is very difficult to assert some kind of sense of locality. There's lots of kind of capitalist structures, and the way that the internet works, the collapsing of time and space through speed and connectivity, it makes it very difficult to approach this sense of the local with any kind of meaningful kind of sense as a singular or simple, straightforward concept. So for me, the idea of locality is very fragmented. It's very difficult and it's very complex to kind of assert what that means anymore, really. So I think, yeah, I think that's one thing that still needs attention, I think, working through ideas about cosmotechnics.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because as soon as we try and assert a kind of geographic locality, we refer to the network, and it's just kind of working through that kind of contradiction is really, really interesting. Helen, do you want to come in and talk a little bit about the kind of relation of cosmotechnics to capitalism and maybe some aspects of your project?
Yeah, I mean, actually referring back to what Paul's saying about the local and about sort of the geographical milieu before I talk about my work, what you're saying, Andy, about the kind of networked world. I mean, the idea of the geographical is so different now. We don't have like these, sort of territories of land and sea that dominate us, because we also have the host, the user, the server, the interface, something that Benjamin Bratton talks about, this kind of vertical sovereignty as opposed to this horizontal sovereignty. And I just wonder how, I suppose what I'm interested in is how that changes our ideas of the local, actually. But in terms of what I've been thinking about, I suppose what struck me, particularly actually about reading Simondon after reading Yuk Hui, is this idea of the relationship with the machine, and also the question of what is the kind of capitalist cosmology that we live within, right? So trying to understand what that might constitute. And I had been looking at, I've been doing two things. I've been taking photographs of my kids playing on iPhones, and also friends' children's playing on iPhones, and looking at the relationship that they have with that, very kind of interior relationship, thinking about like photographs by artists like Jeff Wall, who obviously photographed people watching the screen, in the kind of 90s. And I was just thinking about that kind of relationship, that interior relationship. But also I was looking at Louis Hymes's photographs from the early 20th century, where he basically did a campaign for the, what was it? Elle might be able to remember. It's the national, the campaign against child labour, basically. And there's a huge archive in America which holds his photographs, which you can use basically. And so I was just looking at the sort of differences, like this idea of the relationship, obviously children online working, right? You know, surreptitiously working for big data or, you know, like surveillance capitalism, and then thinking about that relationship in contrast with the kind of more obvious relationship of like the physical corporeal relationship with the machine. And so I suppose that's kind of on a very basic level where these conversations led for me.
Fantastic, that's brilliant. And I want to maybe just give Elle the opportunity to respond to some of the things we've said, and maybe that kind of capitalist cosmology feels like a key word. I mean, sort of something that we're all having to unpack and think through. So I'm wondering if you had any kind of off-the-cuff remarks about any of that.
Yeah, no, I think there are a number of thoughts that have come through. So I'm just going to try to get through them. But I think one of the things Yuk Hui points out in the question concerning technology in China is also he is trying to present an approach to technology that is not just relying on like Heidegger's approach, where technology is in framing. And really, if we consider now what internet technologies in particular, and especially connecting to data mining, is we're seeing Heidegger's understanding of technology as in framing brought to an extreme. And that is this kind of dominant framework where we are now in standing reserve for big data. And as Helen points out, that includes children.
Elle, can you just explain what you mean by enframing?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Enframing is, to go back to Heidegger, in Heidegger's essay, The Question Concerning Technology, which is where the title for Hui's book comes from, he describes how the threat of technology is not anything in itself technological. So it's not the machines we use, but is this capacity of technology to enframe, which means to put our actions to particular uses, so that basically we are really the standing reserve for the action of the machine. And to connect this to big data, it's really, especially surveillance capitalism, where we are the raw material of capitalism.
So obviously there's that move between kind of, you know, the exploitation of physical resources of the earth, and now it's the kind of exploitation of the self. That kind, you mean that kind of movement? Yeah.
Yes. And for Heidegger in particular, oh, sorry, Simon, do you want to jump in?
No, you carry on. I'll say something after.
No, it's just with Heidegger, what he pointed out, especially in the question concerning technology, is this isn't just about the tools. So he wants to get away from blaming the tech, but it goes back to our ontological understanding of technology that he traces back to the Greeks. So with the Greeks, it was thinking about technology could have the influence of poiesis, or this idea of having this kind of creation that comes out of it, or this gestel, or enframing, which is that kind of exploitation that Heidegger talks about. And that's also what Hui is responding to, is that Heidegger goes back to the Greeks, which is that kind of Promethean understanding of technology. If you think of the Greek god Prometheus bringing fire to the humans as a kind of tool. But he's saying China has a different cosmological understanding of tech because they don't have the myth of Prometheus.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Al.
Yeah, that's really brilliant. Simon, did you want to say?
Well, yeah, it's just a comment on Helen's work, because what I found, we had a really interesting conversation in one Zoom call I remember, and it was about you just kind of mentioned the kind of the distinction between the interior kind of reflection on these screens and then the corporeal kind of engagement with machines. And one of the really fascinating things I found was that kind of obviously Victorian times weren't great for children, but there was a sort of engagement with the machines and the physicality that kind of looks better than now. You know, you kind of start to think, actually, we kind of look back at those days as we kind of really moved forward, but actually there's something much more insidious going on with the sort of the current relationship that's kind of And I think Elle, you kind of, when you were kind of talking about and framing it, kind of, and you know where we are now, it kind of it's a kind of scary place, right? In some ways, and what's happening, and yeah, the sort of mental control that's kind of happening under the surface. So yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to follow up on that, because I kind of think that's quite a fascinating area, that dynamic.
So, something about as well, I suppose, this idea, which I know Simondon talks about, is like alienation, and he talks about, he sort of he kind of says that there's an obvious alienation that Marx talks about, which is, you know, we don't have own the means of production, right? So we're sort of economically alienated. But he says that actually bankers can be alienated from the machine. It's not that, because and Elle, maybe you can get more to this, but this idea that like people are overlooking an assembly of machines. They're kind of just, whereas prior we would have, say, a hammer and there'd be a feedback corporeally with that hammer, but like now, and then we move into this kind of industrial age where people are just like kind of like managing like machines. And then I'm just trying to get my head around what's happening now, you know, like it's a different dynamic again. I don't know, maybe somebody could say what the dynamic is.
Elle, would you like to respond?
Sure. And this is also where Hui's work, especially in one of his book, where he talks about digital objects, where he, and it's in response to Heidegger, where it's like, where Heidegger's like, it's nothing in itself technological, but here he brings in Simondon and saying, actually, it is about the tech. So it's, you know, that's the important contribution of Simondon, is Simondon is not just trying to get to this kind of philosophical understanding of what tech, this ontological understanding of tech, but looks at the tech itself. And you can see that throughout his writing, where he gives these very detailed descriptions of how machines work. And that is also because Simondon is trying to kind of break from that empirical ontological binary. He's pointing out how they're all interconnected. Mm. And so this kind of alienation he talks about with Simondon is, you know, the alienation comes from, we don't actually know how the tech works. So you have bankers who, you know, are, you know, working with money. Where did that money come from? Where did these, you know, algorithms that are trading at such high speeds with such large quantity of cash, what are they actually doing? Well, we don't really know. And we can see this throughout. I mean, the fact that now a mechanic, when you go to bring your car in, they have to hook the car up to a computer to figure out what's wrong with it. It's not a matter of listening to the car, going through, you know, trying out the different parts. And you're getting away from that engagement with the machine, and that's being pushed onto the computer to do the analysis for us.
And as I understand it, Simondon almost kind of rejects the Marxist kind of notion of alienation through capital, yeah. And he kind of says that it's just technology is a problem. We're alienated from that as well. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of, that's quite a problematic kind of thing, isn't it? It's kind of a complicated thing, because technology and capital are so closely linked. It's very hard to unpick what the implications of that are.
I mean, that seems like something that your project is very deeply rooted in, though, Simon. The idea of producing a kind of non-alienated relationship to technology.
Yeah, but in a very specific musical sense, I'm really interested in that, in the idea that it would be. I think there's an argument that that the sort of alienation that happens through the Marx kind of identified with machines, through kind of people getting alienated through their workplaces, through not kind of understanding the machines, and it's kind of happening in music, in a sense that it's so easy to just create any type of music through kind of dropping in a loop and not investing the time into understanding how to play it and those kind of things. So I'm kind of trying to make this sort of way of making music that is actually alive, and I've modified a flamenco guitar to actually play it along with the synth, rather than collecting samples. So it's kind of about the, like I was saying earlier, the living energies of these things, and engaging in those as opposed to recorded artifacts, and trying to kind of identify with the, you know, the living culture of flamenco and the living culture of synthesizers, if you can even call it that. You know, there's kind of I'm quite fascinated by the fact that, because I'm kind of colliding flamenco with synthesizers, but they're both these sort of worlds that people pour themselves into, and yeah, somehow keep creating a kind of portal between the two.
So just to clarify, in the pieces you're producing, the acoustic guitar sounds are fed into the synthesizer.
Yeah,
and you can correct me if I'm wrong. And then the synthesizer kind of live responds.
Yeah, and it's not. It's
sounds.
a bit different to the idea of perhaps a sort of you know, an effects pedal where the sound might be modified. It's more like the machine would respond in a particular way. And there's a kind of history, a tradition of working with synthesizers that was very much about you know, listening to the machine and letting it do stuff, which came out of the West Coast of America, and synth makers like Buchla and Serge is what I've been building. They kind of, people were making synthesizers and kind of taking it away completely from music in a way, just letting them to hear what they sounded like, and it's a sort of cybernetic idea of music, of just machines generating their own sounds and tuning into that, and trying to combine that with something that is very different and very physical and human and rich in kind of locality and all the rest of it. Yeah,
that's brilliant. In a sort of, well, tangentially but maybe connected way, in some of the collages that I've been making, I've been kind of trying to make the kind of imagery of the past, of kind of like a Anglo-Saxon milieu, rebound onto the kind of the forms of image making and the technologies of the 21st century. So there's been lots of kind of making silhouettes of sort of Anglo-Saxon sort of symbols and images, which then kind of images of kind of 20th and 21st century technologies are sort of embedded into, and thinking in quite complicated and sort of frustratingly kind of uncomfortable ways about making relationships between senses of kind of archival arrangement, which, you know, we might get from people like Abby Warburg, or within the kind of displays of sort of like Marcel Bruderfer's Museum of Eagles, for example, the kind of and then the abstract sort of symbolic languages of artists around abstract expressionism like Adolf Gottlieb, and feeding all of that through the kind of narrativity of particular kind of Anglo-Saxon kind of idioms and symbols and narrative structures within art. So that idea of the kind of the things, this is something we might pick up on a little bit later a bit more, but the idea of things rebounding seems to become, or interconnecting or reacting seems to become kind of an aspect of an artistic response to this sense of a kind of capitalist milieu. Paul, you've been looking at Sarah Sharma's ideas of power chronology. And I was wondering if you might want to sort of unpack a little bit more, to try and unpack that idea of a capitalist cosmology, to maybe talk about some of her ideas a little bit more.
Yeah, Sarah Sharma's book In the Meantime is a great read actually, and she talks about this her term power chronology, which is, you know, it brings in kind of Foucauldian ideas about kind of power structures, but she's exploring how they're kind of manifest within time and experiences of time. So she looks at people from different employment backgrounds, like taxi drivers who might be on the clock, and their entire way of making money is very directly, tightly bound to the kind of the clock they've got in their taxi. And she also looks at business people who might be flying around the world, and in some ways kind of be beyond the kind of clock, because they're moving through these temporal liminal spaces in airports where the time zones shift, and they're constantly kind of moving around the world in a way that they're kind of unleashed or kind of freed from those kind of tight temporal structures that might be experienced by a taxi driver. And then she looks at these kind of lifestyle hotels in Japan, these slow hotels where you can, if for wealthy people, they can live in these spaces, and they have kind of very strict rules about a life being lived slow. And she kind of talks about the kind of capital of those places and how, you know, it might be linked into a capitalism of time. But it's a fascinating book, and I think it links in to the kind of ideas of time in cosmotechnics as well. And time in cosmotechnics, the way that it comes about seems to be more linked in with Stiegler's ideas about time, how time and memory and consciousness are very interrelated in these ideas, and Stiegler's idea of tertiary retention, and this sense that there might be an external memory of technology that is just out there and kind of feeds back into the ways that we kind of create technologies is very fascinating. If, you know, thinking about tertiary retention and some kind of externalized memory, it's this sense of, you know, what if it has its own roots and its own paths and its own kind of control beyond the human, then, you know, what you know, is it possible to control it, or what is controlling it? How is it moving and doing the things that it's doing? So yeah, I think Sarah Sharma's power chronology is quite a good idea of, you know, how you could be more specific about the impact of these concepts of time impacting upon people's lives. And not only that, but Sharma's ideas are very bound in this sense of ethics and a criticism of capitalism and kind of contemporary life in ways that really make quite clear and quite apparent, you know, the impact of kind of time and experience of time.
So I'm really struck just thinking out loud to the things you've said there, Paul, and I'm going to kind of invite you to respond to this, Helen, perhaps in terms of your own work. There's something that emerges out of that, of this idea of tertiary retention and kind of capitalist cosmology, of a sort of like almost like an internalized psychodynamics of self-regulation. And I'm thinking in particular, because we've brought up Foucault, I'm thinking in particular of Deleuze's essay, Societies of Control. I was wondering if, you know, coming out of your own work of children and technological interfaces, if you wanted to respond to that at all, Helen, or if you had anything to add, Al, as well.
I mean, I was just thinking in terms of memory. It struck me again reading Simondon about, like, he talks about human memory and mechanic memory, and I mean, it just kept making me think a lot about the blockchain. You know, this immutable ledger, right, that you know, records time, records transactions, and we know when they happened, and we know they happened because it's a decentralized system, you know, that kind of comes to an agreement that something happened, and then it goes onto the blockchain. And I was just thinking about that sort of, I suppose, that form of document or evidence or witness, and also like this need for witness and document and evidence, you know, that I suppose some cultures, or particularly Western culture, has this like sort of desperate need to know what's happened when it's happened, you know. And I don't know, that's just something I was thinking about when you're talking about memory, and because I'm trying to think about what these cosmologies are, I suppose, what these capitalists.
I mean, I get the impression that Hui's kind of talking about how we need to look after or kind of investigate the kind of things that don't capture time in that way, and that's the kind of locality and this, you know, that, yeah, certain things, you know, the chi energy isn't quantifiable, and that's problematic in a way.
Well, apart from, I think we also have these very sort of idealized ideas of what the West and the East is. And like, you know, my experience, for instance, of acupuncture, which is my only experience of what the qi is actually, you know, an acupuncturist sits there and they take your pulse and they look at your tongue. They're doing measurements, you know, it's not like, like this energy is unquantifiable. It's quantifiable, but within that system. So I just think it's really careful. You've got to be careful not to kind of idealize one side.
And I don't think it's a question of East or West or any of these things. It's kind of because, you know, there's loads of examples of sort of I don't know, different ways of working with nature in every country, you know, and you know, like take hedgerows, for example, that are about to be kind of knocked down through planning regulation and stuff, things that don't fit into the kind of quantifiable kind of
schema.
The scheme, it kind of just get eroded, don't they? So I think it's a kind of that kind of, for me, that sense of locality and don't know if you've got something to say on this subject there.
Yeah, no, I want to actually bring it back to Paul, what he raised about tertiary retentions from Stiegler, because I think that can actually provide some clarification around these points, because we're talking about different kinds of externalizations of memory in documents. But just to go back to Stiegler, so what Stiegler describes as the tertiary retention is a building upon Husserl's idea. So if primary retention is your interaction with someone, secondary retention is you recalling the memory of that interaction, and tertiary retention is some externalization. So writing it down, taking a photograph, producing an audio recording. And that was Stiegler's idea. And I know this will bring a tangent in, but Hui actually introduces the idea of tertiary protension, which is then thinking about how technology can inform our actions. But we'll get back to that. But coming back to Cosmotechnics, Helen made the point of, you know, in the West and Eurocentric cultures, we have certain documents to provide evidence. And we have to think also, though, that there are particular documents that are privileged. So things like contracts, things like legislation, things like blockchain. I've been recently reading the work by Dylan Robinson. He has a book called Hungry Listening, Resonant Theory for Indigenous Sound Studies. And he talks about how in certain indigenous cultures in the United States, a song can be a law, but this will not be recognized in a Canadian court, for example.
And this also actually, brings me back to a book, an amazing book by Mariscal de la Cadena. I don't know if you've read that book, about the Peruvian Uprisings, and again, how they, you know, a mountain is an earth being in their, you know, worldview, but it's not recognized as an as a being within, you know, the sort of Peruvian governmental system, you know. So, you know, if they want to put something through that mountain, you know, they don't have the same kind of relationship with that mountain. And also that, you know, they do not have documents of ownership, right? So, you know, it's again, and what documents take precedent, I suppose, is the question as well, and how those documents are made. Like, you know, the technologies that we, you know, the pen is a document, is a tool, you know, the blockchain is a tool to record, you know, even going to an auction. It's really interesting because I did this whole piece on auctions. You know, you're witnessing a transaction, right? An auction is about being present in a space to witness a transaction, so that other people can say this happened, you know, this sale of this house happened, or this, you know. So like there's so many, it's very interesting, all these different layers, I suppose.
And then actually to come here, though, to bring it back to these are different cosmologies that are influencing what technologies are considered the ones that matter. And so that is also where we can see that invitation from Hui to break from this kind of not just, you know, Eurocentric, but really a colonizing force around the world through digital technologies. It's a colonization of this Greek understanding of technology and what happens when we shift the cosmology there. So, you know, he talks about in relation to China, but also thinking, you know, we can think of different indigenous cultures in the Americas. You know, thinking about Diana Taylor writes a lot about how the repertoire is a way of preserving information as opposed to the archive. And this comes from different cosmologies.
This kind of goes back to, sorry, Paul.
Well, Paul first.
Yeah, I got in there first. Yeah, just saw this this great article by Yuriko Furuhata called "Of Dragons and Geoengineering: Rethinking Elemental Media," and it's a really good kind of example of what I was talking about there, with the architecture of Hong Kong buildings and how some of them have got really big holes in the structures of them, and just how so they're talking about how those holes are kind of part of like a feng shui kind of system to let spirit dragons kind of move through the mountains to the sea, and it would be kind of bad feng shui to block them and it kind of make them angry. You have that kind of traditional cosmology at play, but they're also functioning as kind of airflow and have kind of an architectural purpose as well in terms of structure. So it's just quite interesting how sometimes you get these different cosmologies like at play within the same place, or how one might lead to another, or the sequence of them. But yeah, just another example.
Just to chuck my oar in. So you're going to say something as well, Simon. Go on. You say.
I just thought the conversation that's happening is kind of reminding me of something we were talking about yesterday, Helen, when we were saying how this idea of techno diversity that Hui seems to kind of really be championing is a bit confusing, because in a way there's a lot of diversity in technology. I mean, you can kind of, there's so many different kind of ways, and so we were kind of looking at kind of a bit confused, thinking, well, yeah, there is, but obviously it's being colonized all the time, I guess is perhaps the way to talk about it. Is that right, Elle? I wonder whether you could clear up our discussion we were having yesterday in the garden about that.
Yeah, and that's really a way to see, and that's what I see also, the kind of warning we see coming out of Hui's work, where it's presuming that this way of technology, and it does tend to privilege these kinds of Eurocentric understandings of technology and science, and it's and the way he goes back to it, and that's why the method also of the question concerning technology in China is so interesting, because he's going back into Chinese thought and not trying to create a kind of hierarchy there. He's trying to present that in conjunction or in relation to European philosophy in a very Simondonian way, where it's letting them read off each other. And that's one of the aspirations I see with Cosmotechnics, is bringing in diversity, but without falling into kind of, this kind of cultural, like not just relativity, not just saying, okay, cultures are just different, but instead really thinking about how they can inform each other in the way that, Paul, you described.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of, I guess, kind of say something slightly similar to that as well, Al. And the way you talked about kind of tertiary retention is something kind of, and particularly with the idea of the song won't be recognized in law. There's like a kind of non-human excessiveness. I'm really interested in the excessiveness of all of this, and how that sort of, in a way, sort of feels like it opens out a series of opportunities for translation, or kind of heterologous kind of interactions between cosmologies, rooted in kind of these sort of non-human tertiary retentions, where we're forced to, because you can see this idea of tertiary retention as something that's really dominating and manipulating you. And I guess within a capitalist cosmology, it absolutely is. But it kind of produces its own excess, which dismantles itself at the same time. I don't know if you want to respond to that at all, or anybody.
I was going to say, just say a little bit more about the dismantling itself bit at the end.
Well, insofar as if I guess the idea that kind of machines, if it is the kind of the writing down of something, or the ways in which something like an algorithm might influence or inform action, that's generating a kind of whole series of points within the world, within the machinic cosmologies we exist within, that are shaping and informing our actions. But something that artists might be able to do, I'm thinking is kind of, I always try and think of critical strategies. Something that, you know, artists maybe we're engaged with is going back into all of those spaces, all of those structures and systems, and exploiting the kind of uncontrollability of all of that. You know, which agent is going to control all of that? No one's in control of all of these things.
One of the things here too that's coming to mind is, you know, artists also can invite different ways of use. That is also significant. And, you know, Simon does talk about, you know, when you have a machine, there are certain ways that we use it. There are certain gestures that are accompanying it. And artists can enable, you know, when we create something, we can take something and use it differently and invite new ways of use and enable new ways of thinking about how we use it and how we relate to others through that use. Even right now, I mean, we're using the Zoom platform as it's supposed to be used. We're sitting and talking, and but we could have an artistic intervention here that draws attention to the kind of technological constraints of the Zoom platform and how that's informing our relation to each other. You know, we can't talk on top of each other because of the way the sound restricts that. So there's a way we could, you know, as artists, intervene there.
So do you think Zoom facilitates like better conversations because people have to listen to each other? They have to stop and listen.
I wouldn't say better, but a particular kind of conversing. It's changing how we talk to each other.
We're giving each other more space, maybe.
Yeah.
So tertiary, this kind of excessiveness of tertiary retentions within a kind of like multiplicity of cosmologies, but perhaps within the kind of molar structure of a capitalist, dominant capitalist cosmology, is something we've started to unpack quite effectively. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about your own practice, Paul, and the piece you've made for the exhibition, because I think one thing that sort of you're adding to that conversation is the significance of the kind of what we might call the natural world, or kind of environmental stimuli or ecology to those dynamics. So do you want to maybe talk about your own project a little bit and the importance of ecology to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, the work that I made is called The Clouds Under the Sea, and it is a digital simulation of an experimental data server that Microsoft placed under the sea off the coast of the Orkney Isles a few years back. And what they were trying to do was finding a better way of cooling data servers. And one of the major kind of energy costs for data and the world of data and data servers is just making them work at the right temperature. The computers get incredibly hot, and it takes and they're working all the time. So in order to make sure that they don't fail, all of these racks of computer disks, they're kind of, each rack's got kind of 3 or 4 kind of spinning disks in them. So they need to be kind of temperature controlled. So usually how it's done in a data center is they have these kind of air systems where cold air, they have like a closed water cooling system where they'll have some water which is chilled, kind of like the way a fridge works, and then the cold air is pushed around the data center, and they'll cool one aisle and not the other, so that there's this kind of air system in place to make everything nice and cool. I just visited one this week, and one aisle, you could be wearing shorts and a t-shirt, it's so hot, and then the next aisle you go in, it's freezing cold. So Microsoft was interested in trying to find new ways of using what they would call free cooling or natural cooling, which is basically just putting stuff under the sea in Scotland, which of course is going to be very low temperature. It's very low temperature in Scotland, like, above sea level. So yeah, so that they did this. It's kind of like when you look at the work, you can see what it looks like. And it was quite interesting. I was kind of tracking this project and seeing how it was going, and they had a webcam under the sea so that you could check in on how the project was going. And it just took a few weeks for the webcam to be what they call biofouled, which is absolutely covered in mollusks and kind of sea kind of organisms that had grown over the lens of the camera. So you couldn't see anything. It just looked, you know, completely murky and dark. But in some ways, the project is about visibility. It's about trying to make visible some of the hidden locations and geographies of kind of contemporary digital life. And in that respect, I think it's quite an important project to point at these places and to try and understand the types of activities and power structures and relationships they have to the world. One of the key things to do with data is just to do with energy use and how incredibly energy hungry lots of our daily digital activities are. You know, it's things like sending emails, streaming TV, and for me, one of the most interesting aspects of that is to think about kind of digital images specifically, and how, you know, the way that we construct digital images is connected to nature. But in the broader sense of just thinking about data, you know, the kind of entire industry demands a lot more scrutiny in terms of how kind of energy use and nature is combined into those places. So I think in relation to Cosmotechnics, yeah, I was kind of thinking through, you know, how do those cosmological thought structures, or the kind of the histories and traditions and superstitions about technology, you know, how do they relate to these ideas about geoengineering? Because this is kind of, it's not like a full-on geoengineering project, but it kind of is. You know, that Microsoft have used natural space to try and create like a different way of powering or cooling these technologies. So the cloud and the sea is kind of this, you know, the title kind of references this, the kind of change of a system that moves from being an entirely technological one to a system that incorporates the natural as well as the technical. But to me, I haven't resolved this, and it's something that's going to keep me thinking for at least a couple of years. But it's this idea of with geoengineering projects, with big tech trying to fix climate change through these what seem on the face of it to be very kind of capitalist dominated modes of technology, and very kind of Silicon Valley-esque Ayn Randian ways of thinking about, you know, technology. How do those geoengineering projects, you know, kind of relate to Cosmotechnics, and are they driven by this kind of Western Promethean kind of prospect of technology, or is there something else going on there? So I think it's quite an interesting context, I think, to analyze through the lens of Cosmotechnics.
Sorry, Paul, can I just, I'm just really interested, this idea of reciprocity. So like whether or not, I've been reading a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know if anyone else has read it. And there's some really, well, I mean, it calls for reciprocity in a way, you know, with the more than human, this book. And it talks, and so I just wonder if like Google have ever thought to ask the beings under the sea, you know, is it okay? Do you know what I mean? To put these structures here, or, you know, I suppose, I mean, you know, there's a really interesting chapter in Braiding Sweetgrass where it talks about the indigenous population, I think it's in Canada, who use they harvest sweetgrass, and the author, she's a biologist, and she's also from an indigenous tribe, and she has a PhD student who wants to look at the relationship between the harvesting of the sweetgrass, you know, because what they've noticed is that the population of sweetgrass is diminishing in certain places, and in other places it's pretty, you know, healthy, and it's actually healthier in the places where the indigenous population live and harvest it, which goes against the normal idea that, you know, if you harvest something, you're depleting it. And essentially what happens is it's about this relationship, this kind of like idea of, you know, actually talking to these plant intelligences, these beings, and, you know, asking, you know, is this okay? Can we harvest some, not taking more than you need, but, you know, kind of entering into a conversation almost. And, you know, and sort of also the fact that she evidences that, you know, that you can harvest, but harvest it in a kind of way, you know, that's kind of always been done, where people are like, you know, literally kind of, you know, asking permission, right? And so I was just wondering about how that could, you know, whether that kind of idea or that sort of cosmological kind of framework could start to infiltrate into like big tech's mindset. I don't know.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think on the Microsoft site with the research that they published, they responded to questions about whether or not it was damaging the environment, and they said that the external temperature output was negligible, so it didn't, you know, it was immediately dissipated by the sea, and there wasn't really much kind of impact from that. But when you look at it, there's, you know, there's mollusks and all sorts of sea life kind of attached to this structure. So it's quite interesting, those types of loops that occur. But I think you're right, it's quite complex, isn't it? It's when we're talking about locality and you get into the details of it, we're talking about local, you know, kind of plant life, vegetation and animal life, and the locality of a place, it, you know, brings to bear these very kind of diverse kind of ecological systems that are in place. And I think maybe this idea of the local, it, you know, requires that level of granular detail to think through, you know, how a technology might be used, you know, in some kind of ethical or you know, kind of useful way, cosmological way within locality.
If I could just make a quick observation, what did they call it? A fouling when it got covered?
It's biofouling. Yeah,
Yeah.
biofouling.
Yeah, even the use of the term of fouling,
Yeah.
when it's just like creatures are living on a camera and it has that connotation of some kind of damage there, is already pointing where the, you know, where the cosmology of Microsoft
It's exactly
is.
right. Yeah, the language with the way that nature is referred to within all of the kind of data center energy work that I've done so far, it's always about free cooling. And it's like, well, what do you mean? Are you talking about the sea? Are you talking about living in a cold country? It's always bound by, you know, terms of capital and money.
And I guess like some companies are obviously using solar power to provide the energy for servers, but then you kind of got this contradiction where you need the sun for the kind of energy of it, and then the coldness for the cooling. And right, yeah.
A lot of the kind of green energy systems that are being used still they're still massively reliant upon extractivist kind of processes to, you know, remove lots of metal from the earth. And, you know, it's often not happening in very green places. You know, we were talking before about kind of indigenous rights and kind of cosmologies, but, you know, in Australia there was the London Mining Institute did a great event a couple of years ago where I watched a documentary about Australian indigenous communities that were, the land, they owned the land, but it wasn't recognized in Australian courts. So mining companies were going out there and, you know, kind of offering them a car, very poor communities in quite kind of sparsely populated areas. And they would offer them some kind of monetary kind of prize to give up their land rights and, you know, kind of trick and deceive these communities into losing it. And then they would be in, and there would be a massive mine being started up in these places. And, you know, so like the kind of politics of green energy use, I'm not so sure about yet. It's something else that I'm kind of think will keep me going for a while trying to.
I think sorry, no, I think what's interesting is this idea where like the sort of assembly between the human and the machine, like, or you know, these relationships where it could be symbiotic, like it's not like, and I think that's what the braiding sweetgrass example is, which maybe I didn't quite say properly, but that, you know, the population of sweetgrass was flourishing because there was a symbiotic relationship with the human. And so the possibility for that, I think, is also something that is maybe what Yuk Hui is kind of aiming towards somehow, that there is this space where these sort of assemblies and kind of coexistences can happen, but obviously we just haven't got there, or we need to work on it, basically.
You've been developing a PhD proposal on the side of kind of in a parallel track to doing this exhibition, which sort of feels like it's very relevant to that point. Helen, do you want to explain the project very briefly?
Yeah, so it's kind of a coming together of like several strands of my work. Obviously, you know, I've run a birthrights collection which looks at reproductive care, and I'm very interested in technology and the effects of technology and, you know, infrastructural technologies. And so the project plans to look at this idea of more than human healthcare, and I'm going to look between artificial intelligence, which is obviously, there's a big revolution in healthcare that's happening, and but alongside this I want to look at psychedelics, plant intelligence. So obviously, again, it's like the kind of, we get slightly this dichotomy between like the sort of the mechanic and the natural, but I feel like the two things can speak to each other. And so there's a lot of research happening at the moment, well, at King's College in London. There's the psilocybin trials, which I've going to spend time working with people who are using, taking psilocybin, you know, to heal depression. And I'm also going to work in the Centre for Medical Imaging at King's, and also in Oslo, where they're developing AI prosthetics. And I want to go to Colombia and work with a shaman who, you know, uses entheogenic plant medicines. And so, like, there's a huge, obviously, diverse techniques going on there. And just to see, you know, in this kind of age of like anthropological, ecological kind of catastrophe, you know, that's kind of impending, like, how can these things speak to each other? Because, you know, these relationships with the more than human have always existed, and it's, you know, and it's just finding ways to kind of look at a kind of dialogue, I suppose.
Brilliant. I'm going to sort of start to try and bring things to a close now, because we've talked in such rich detail about so many aspects. Does anybody have any kind of closing comments they'd like to make?
I just wonder whether we've got time to, it would be great to hear a little bit about Els, because we've all had an opportunity to talk about our practices. I wonder whether, I know Elle hasn't made a project specifically for the exhibition, but it'd be interesting to hear about the book that we've talked about, or whatever, how you feel Cosmotechnics is perhaps important to what you're doing. Would be great.
That would be wonderful, yeah.
Sure. Well, lately, so I've been working on a number of projects, and lately I've actually been, in addition to the book that I was working on when I talked to you, that was looking at the relationships between digital subjectivity and the maternal. And so thinking about how certain artists use digital technologies to engage with what it means to be a maternal subject, but also looking at the relationship between the digital and the maternal through an aesthetics of interruption. So thinking about that shared experience of interruption as the grounding of subjectivity. And so that, but through that, I've actually started doing work on live streaming as an aesthetic encounter. So it came from, and that's also where I've been getting engaged with, you know, with Hui's work. I actually came to his work through his work on digital objects, which was connecting Simon Blackmore to Heidegger, and then looking into his work with Cosmotechnics. But with the work of live streaming, it's been thinking about how live streaming is enabling us to rethink our relations to each other, especially with COVID-19, The project came from some of my own experiments in live streaming, where I quickly came against the material limitations of having poor internet connection and how that inhibited my ability to stream. And but during this time, there's been such emphasis on streaming, on our ability to connect, especially because we've been forced, or not forced, we've been, public health guidelines are meaning we cannot physically interact. And so how is this influencing our connections? But this is kind of turned into this project where I actually go back and look at the work of the cam girls of the 1990s as ones who modified webcams as ways of streaming or broadcasting their experiences, and through this kind of situated engagement with tech. So I take a Simondonian reading there, but through that, I've also started looking at the role of streaming in activism and Black Lives Matter in particular over the last summer, and how it's taking these kinds of local engagements, protests, street action, and the connections we draw, but also how a lot of these streamings taking place on social media platforms. And Sophia Noble points out that these are, it's really an exploitation of these experiences, because social media is making money off of this streaming, and it's when it comes to thinking about justice, it's not simply a matter of presenting online, and it can then go through in a court. But in actuality, we have social media companies that are making money really off the death of others. And so looking at that question, the challenges there, and this has also gotten me to think about questions of performative wokeness. But a lot of thinking about streaming, how we connect, how we, it's become a way of our kind of phenomenological engagement with others, even as we're doing this now, and this kind of Zoom aesthetics that also has a risk of colonizing our relations to each other. So that's where I'm going.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that sort of
Fantastic.
performativity of that you kind of go through. I've noticed that my daughter, over the last years, just like she watches a lot of YouTube videos of people describing stuff, and then she'll show you how to do it better. You'll do a YouTube type video for a laugh, and she'll be like, no, that's not going to engage anyone. It's got to be like this, and like, hey, and like it's kind of like, what will the next generation be like? They'll be talking to each other in this kind of hyper kind of attention way. It's kind of so radically different from kind of having grown up without any of that stuff, and having to kind of shyly move your way into it. And that's kind of interesting with your work again, Helen, isn't it? That sort of this sort of what's going on in the minds of these children when they're looking at the screens. They're sort of just processing it and learning, all sorts of stuff that's kind of going to play out.
I mean,
in the next generation.
One of the interesting things in relation to Elle's work is I made this work called YouTube Portraits in 2012, where I was interested in the way that women share knowledge online about their births, because traditionally we'd talked about our births, or then we'd written down in books and we passed books between ourselves. And then suddenly we have this explosion of online media, and we can post videos of our births online. And so what does that do for the process of birth? It's the same question in a sense. How does it shift, and also the performativity of birth as well. I mean, it's huge. So I can relate. I think it's a very interesting subject.
Actually, Helen's work I do analyze in one of the chapters of my book. That so looking at YouTube portraits, not just in the videos themselves, but how they relate to network knowledge in relation to birth. And I had observed that some of the videos that prints were taking from are no longer online. So thinking about how it reveals aspects of commercial content moderation.
Yeah. Or censorship by other people, because I think quite a few of them had been taken down. Yeah.
perhaps that's a good place to sort of wrap things up. So we've covered so much territory. It's kind of incredible, really. You'll be able to come and visit the exhibition at cosmotechnics.net, and you'll be able to see some of these kind of aspects of kind of cultural identity, tertiary retention, interconnecting cosmologies, localities, and non-human or ecological interactions played out in some of the work. So please come and have a look at the exhibition. It's an ongoing project, so there'll be more, hopefully physical things happening in the future, and but documented via cosmotechnics.net. So come back, and thanks for listening today. Thanks to everybody.